Find a seat, we will get started. First of all, thanks to everyone for coming. Two tasks we got to get done today. I need to get the policies into as near a finished product as possible so that we can refer them to the policy committee and start that process. Second piece is I want to finalize the job description so that we can post that. Because I'll need 10 days to post it and get interviews set up so I can bring that to the August meeting and have that in place when the school year starts. So those are, for me, the two big objectives today. But we had some visitors today who met with our subcommittee, and I'll turn it over to our chair, Ms. Esep, to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, first of all, I do want to welcome everyone who's joining us via Facebook Live. So I guess we've increased our numbers significantly. There's two is around the table. So again, thank you if you are joining us via, I think it's Facebook. So yeah, the education subcommittee met. We had a great discussion about how we are going to be addressing the trainings of the various groups, and I'm going to let Kristen Jackson talk about that in a moment. And I do want to thank Janie Gaba and Jenna Young, Janie from the Ray Crisis Center and Jenna from Coastal Horizons for bringing those individuals today to our meeting. They've been great partners with us, and it was really nice to have them. I may have reversed this, I'm sorry. But Janie, do you want to talk about, introduce or tell us who came today? Where's Jane?
Yeah.
Or is that
I can do it. So we have Lorena Stallworth. She is the head of the RPE program for the Department of Public Health. And then we had Robin Colbert. She is with the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And then if you want to.
Yeah, and Rebecca Swafford, she is the Delta coordinator for the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And then we had Melissa Siegel-Barros, who does the contract evaluation for both of our programs. So.
And I think in summary, they were very excited about the work that both our subcommittee was doing and has done, and then the committee as a whole is doing. We asked them specifically if anybody else in the state is doing this sort of work, and their answer was basically no, not at the K-12 level. At the college level, yes, but we are in essence blazing a trail, which was exciting to hear, and also slightly terrifying, but overall very exciting. So they were very appreciative of what we're doing and want to stay in touch, and they promised to also report back information to us. So I don't know, Kristen, do you want to add anything about the overall general discussion?
No, just that we came up with some recommendations that we'll be talking and kind of shoring up for everybody that will be moving from the education committee on trainings for staff and students coming up this year.
So we are going to move on to, if there's nothing else from the education subcommittee, we want to move on to policies and procedure overview, and that is Mr. Wayne Woolridge.
Thank you, Ms. Estep. I think each of you has before you the latest revision to the policies. At the last meeting, we talked about several revisions, and what I did was I took the revisions that Amber Resitar from UNCW had suggested and made them, and then I made any additional changes or comments that I had to that document. I think we have two policies in front of you. One is copied with pink paper and one is on white paper. So the one I made the comments and changes to is the one on white paper. And the one on pink paper is the same one you saw last time, except I didn't have a chance to actually embed my suggested changes or comments into this one. But the only change I would recommend for that one is on the first page of the pink pink policy 1710, which is, we'll end up renumbering that one for the New Hampshire County Schools policy manual, but the definition of hostile environment, I believe it was Amber that recommended going to more of a subjective standard, and she struck out some of the language there regarding a reasonable person would have to agree that it is harassment or bullying before it would be considered a hostile environment. And my recommendation is to put that language back in because that language is taken from the North Carolina statute defining hostile environment in the school situation, and is also consistent with the proposed regulations from the Department of Education regulations on Title IX.
So they recommend that language in there.
They recommend a standard which is really subjective and objective. So as you can see, the victim, and we need to change some of this language. As you can see on the other policy, I'm recommending going to the words complainant and respondent rather than victim and perpetrator. But we can go with whatever the group or the committee decides on that. But anyway, the policy in the pink paper still uses the word victim, so I'll read it as written. So it says to be a hostile environment in an educational setting, it means that the victim subjectively views the conduct as harassment or bullying, and the conduct is objectively severe or pervasive enough that a reasonable person would agree that it is harassment or bullying. So that is taken from state law and is very similar to the definition that the Department of Education is recommending, which is a combined subjective and objective standard. So the victim has to believe that it's harassment, and that belief has to be reasonable, is basically what it says. So that's sort of a compromise between a totally subjective standard where if someone believes they're harassed, then they are harassed, or going to a completely objective standard, which would mean regardless of what the victim thinks, if somebody else doesn't think it's harassment, then it's not. So this is sort of a combined standard and the one that I would recommend. If you put that language back in, it's been struck out. Does anybody else have any comments about that? I don't think I had any comments to the other suggested changes to the policy on the pink paper.
And the pink paper is policy.
Pink,
The
one in pink
white
is
is more about
right.
process.
Policy
correct?
in pink is prohibition against discrimination, harassment, and bullying. And harassment includes sexual harassment, and sexual harassment includes sexual assaults. So it's the policy that says that type of conduct is prohibited and defines what it is. The policy on the white paper is the process policy that describes when a complaint is made or when school officials have information concerning a situation. It describes what school officials must do in that situation in terms of investigating and putting in interim measures to protect the parties during the process. So does anybody have any questions or comments about the discrimination, harassment, and bullying policy itself on the pink paper?
So your recommendation is to add back the part that is crossed out right now?
Yes, because otherwise it would be a completely subjective statement.
Which increases the volume.
Does anyone have any discussion about that?
As long as it's in line with what's coming down already from the federal OCRPs, that's, as long as we're aligned to that, it makes sense.
All right, if not,
For, wait, I'm sorry. For our, is Amber here?
she is not here. She said she couldn't be here.
Robbie, what is for your policy, do you know if that is the standard?
We utilize any reasonable person should or may feel uncomfortable within a
So
hostile
you have
environment.
that in your policy as
So
well?
a reasonable person would be good objective standard. So I feel it's appropriate to streamline from the state level, and that's fine with me. I haven't seen this policy. I worked on the process of procedures.
another change that I'd like to see, where we see, it's on the second page, second paragraph. Okay. We have harassment, the last sentence, harassment may occur between members of the opposite sex or the same sex. I would like to see that read, may occur between members of different sexes or the same sex.
Is that the only place that's in the policy, or is there another place that's confusing?
I don't know, this is the first time I've seen this policy too, because I was not here last week, the last meeting, so but I would suggest that we do that throughout, if that shows up.
Which is in keeping with the pronoun changes too.
Correct.
Just while you're looking at it, process-wise, this will now go, after today, go to our policy committee. So that's another opportunity, if you see something, to come back and make some suggestions as we head into policy committee next.
And Leslie, you're saying, instead of opposite sex, we're trying to make sure that we're being broader based.
Right,
That
exactly.
it's not just one or the other, that there are gender or.
Right, and gender and sex in common language get uses,
Presentation.
interact,
So we just make that notation that anywhere that it's listed opposite sex, change that to different sex.
yeah, members of different sexes
Yeah,
or the same sex.
yeah, so we just hit that.
I have the appropriate verbiage, I can get that from OCR. And it encompasses all of them.
And what's OCR?
I'll just-
Just for those that are watching this call.
But I would agree with that. And I have that, we can make those changes.
Thank you, Robert.
Maybe you want to keep going? You got my.
All right, so other than that, there really weren't a lot of suggested changes to the policy on the pink paper. I'm going to move to the other policy, which is the process policy. We're going to have different numbers for our policy, so that's why the number 1720 is struck out basically everywhere that it appears. In the definition section, there was a lot of discussion last time about what we should call the parties to a complaint, the person making the complaint, the person who's being accused. And I know there are a lot of different ways to refer to them, and we're probably not going to all agree on what to call them. There are some policies that you see will use alleged victim, alleged perpetrator. Some will use reporter. Some will use complainant. Some will use respondent and complainant together. So I looked at the proposed regs from the Department of Education, and they use complainant and respondent. So they are sort of legalistic sounding terms, but that's what I put in here. There are other ways to refer to them. To me, it doesn't matter in terms of having a legally enforceable policy what names you use, as long as you're consistent. But if you use the words victim and perpetrator, then in a lot of situations, you're going to have to put the word alleged in front of it, because when a complaint is first made, you don't know whether there is a victim or a perpetrator. So you would have to call them alleged victim and alleged perpetrator, and then you'd have to change the verbiage. Once there's been a determination that the person is guilty, then they become a perpetrator, and the complainant becomes the victim. So rather than have to change the language, I thought it would be better to change the language in the policy, and during the process, I thought it would be better just to go with the complainant and respondent. That's just my preference, and certainly if the group has other ideas, we can talk about it.
Wayne, one of the suggestions that you had made, you said one of them was reporter. So does the person who is alleging the harassment, discrimination, whatever, have to be the reporter? So like, let's say it was my kid and I am being the reporter on behalf of my child. would that make a difference in what we call?
Yeah, I think that could potentially lead to an unclear definition, because a teacher could be the reporter. And
Or
a teacher
teacher,
can
right.
report harassment of a student, and so in that case, the way the policy is written, reporter would refer to the student, and if the student's not the one who reported it, I'm not sure that is as clear, but,
Well, that's what I was just trying to figure out, what was the most clear word?
I
so that
I
it
wasn't
could be-
recommending going to reporter, I
Okay.
think somebody else had commented on that.
Okay,
So,
Wouldn't complaint be the, kind of the same?
but is it, that's what I was trying to figure out, is
Yeah,
the
I-
complainant the person that actually happened to? Does it have to happen to me, or can my mom, or can my teacher, or can my neighbor, report on my behalf?
Because even sometimes the student it's actually happened to may not be the one reporting it, may not be comfortable, but another student may be the one coming forward. That's a great point.
The thing that makes me uncomfortable about getting rid of victim and perpetrator is, as a layperson reading this, I get confused about, I understand it, but very quickly, if you say alleged victim, I'm like, oh, that's the person who said something happened to them, and alleged perpetrator, oh, that's the person they said did it. That immediately, instinctively, I know who those are. When you say respondent, that is not instinctively clear to me who you're talking about without, I know what those other things are without reading the definitions. And that concerns me as we're trying to communicate this policy and make people comfortable with the policy and comfortable with knowing what to do, that this language seems less clear.
But it would be defined in the definitions, and as long as it's consistent throughout like all policies.
I mean, that makes it enforceable, but I mean, if you're a parent reading this,
And I think that's where education is gonna have to come in too, where you are really being, so there's the policy language that is always going to, I think, have a little level of legalese that is not gonna be easily digestible to your average Joe and Jane citizen, that then is incumbent upon us to do a better job of the education to Joe and Jane citizen to say, here's what that means, here's how you still access that, here's who that means. I like complainant and respondent only because when you even say alleged victim, there are a lot of people who don't identify there that would qualify for being harassed and have an issue and a legitimate concern within the schools, that once you say or label them an alleged victim, then they are a little concerned about rising, they themselves are a little concerned about rising to the level of calling themselves an alleged victim. But a complainant, really, you're still meeting the criteria, and then I think it's incumbent upon our education of the public in general, that we're consistent in all ways, even those of us that are service providers in the community, that we're also very aware that that's the difference, and that we would educate as we do programming in the schools and with parents and folks out in the community, that there's a difference. I just find that the policies are always going to be higher legalese and not as easily digestible for the lay person, which is what makes them so complex to actually apply.
I feel it's very appropriate to use the term complainant. Yes, the complainant, simply because it keeps a person from being identified as not having power. And when we use a term like victim, it sounds like we're taking some power away when you think about operating in the best interest of a person who wants to make a stand based upon their sense of needing justice. And so I think using the term complainant empowers a person versus calling them an alleged victim.
I think these are really good points, and I'm a lot more comfortable with that and with the ability to digest complainant. Respondent,
That's the same with me.
I'm a little uncomfortable with that because the respondent is the person who is responding, just in common terms. I'm not, without carefully reading the definitions, understanding that this is the person who is being accused. So, I don't know if accused is the word we want to use. you know, I haven't given a lot of thought to what these
I
overlay
think,
things
well,
are.
I think in the terms of what this is for, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think the job of this is to say that there is this complaint, and the person's job is to respond to that complaint and whatever's happened. So I think in terms of what this kind of purpose is, I do think that does make a lot of sense in terms of what these particular document and kind of what that's for. It does, you know, make, you know, if you have a complaint against you, you have to respond to what that is and kind of lay out what your actions did. So I think it does make sense, because really the reality is what this is that it needs to be like non-partial. You know, it has to be able to be something that allows both parties to kind of come in and say, this is what the situation was. And I think it's very non-partial language. It's very much kind of, this is what it is. So I kind of do think that that language makes a lot of sense in this.
And Wade, you said it's, sorry, Julie, you said it's consistent with this
Yes.
Department of Education.
They use complainant and respondent.
Yes.
One of the reasons why I think that the term respondent is a much better term to use is because many times once we get those investigations in the office, we may determine that it was conflict or just total misunderstanding. And it allows a person to be a respondent as opposed to an offender. And in those cases where there's either mistaken identity or misunderstanding, we always recommend there's a follow-up with the person who is identified as the offender or respondent. So I think that when you understand that we're not being guilty and then proven innocent, it's that you're innocent until proven guilty, that it allows, especially when you have a young child, to understand that we're looking at them as a person who needs to respond to someone having accused them of certain conduct. And so it allows for help, especially when we move to providing support through counselors or whatever, to be able to do that without feeling like they were labeled in some way.
And it's not lost on service providers that there's a very fine line for the schools to have to balance. Again, you've got, if it's two students, that one is the complainant, one is the respondent, and they're both students. What I would tell you after 31 years is there is a lot that goes into a criminal investigation that would even lead to charges. So again, even if there are no charges filed against, in a situation where we feel that there is something that has occurred, we still have two students that need to have access to public education, and indeed, either way, they need to have the best education. Both sides of that equation need to have the best education going forward and be safe. So I think that's really what our committee, the SMART committee, is really trying to. It's not you don't have an easy task. You don't, and I feel like you're doing a really good job of trying to bridge that.
And truly, since we're thoroughly funding, that's kind of, complainant and respondent runs parallel with Department of Ed and DOSIO. So yes, that's the best practice. Can you lighten it up, K through 12? I've been thinking about it. You could use reporting party and responding party, if that would make everybody happy, but you would have to put that in your definitions. But under the umbrella of Department of Ed and OCR, complainant and respondent is across the nation. I've seen some other terms. I'm not a fan of complainant. I think they're filing a complaint. I think they're reporting. And when you get into the reporting party, whether it's a mom, whether it's a friend, whether it's an uncle, aunt, or another teacher, reporting an incident, don't get confused. The processes and procedures will clean that up. Because truly, you end up with a complainant or a reporting party, and you end up with a respondent or someone that has heart failure. But I don't like heart failure. That's a lame. I agree. Because truly, this due process, with many incidents, it could be light, it could be heavy. At the end of the day, it should be, again, under the Department of Ed, a fair, impartial process. Whether the law enforcement and legal get involved, and sometimes, but you have to be consistent, and I did put that in our procedures with Mr. Bull, just be consistent. If you're consistent, you can go.
All right.
Second is past page 1.
Yeah.
Hopefully
Well, I do want, I'm sorry, I do want to talk about the comments in the side columns. Wayne, have you addressed those, or I'm assuming it came from?
If it says WB and then a number, that's me.
Okay.
If it says RH, that's Robbie. And if it's, I think Amber's are designated as, let's see if I can find one of hers. Some of them somehow didn't indicate who they came from, so if somebody wants to identify the ones that don't have initials by them, they could be Amber.
So have those comments been addressed, like for the first one, are we adding sexual misconduct, the definitions through policy, the sexual violence, sexual harassment, stalking, are we providing the definitions and adding
The
those to policy?
definitions are in the first policy we looked at in the pink paper. They define harassment and bullying, and sexual harassment, but they don't, I don't think, define, I don't think they have separate definitions for sexual misconduct, but I think sexual misconduct is within the definition of sexual harassment, if I'm correct. But yeah, we can review that and make sure that all those definitions are in there.
If we're having definitions, I think we probably should put that somewhere in there.
So I think after looking at this again, probably if the comments don't have anybody's initials, they were probably Amber's.
Okay. On that, as we're about that, I just want to make
Yeah.
sure that we've addressed the comments as written, so.
Yeah.
Either the committee has decided that we're okay with it as is, or, that we agree with the change, with the comment, we want to substitute.
So, since it took us until 4 o'clock to go through the first page, I won't go through every single proposed change. I will certainly let anybody comment, or I would think it would be appropriate for anybody to comment on any of the changes if you would like. So what I would like to do is each step, if it's okay, is I'll just kind of hit the highlights of the changes, and then if anybody wants to go back to any of the others, in the interest of time, because there were a lot of wording changes throughout, and then some more minor changes. What I would like to do is point out on pages are not numbered. So 1, 2, the bottom of the third page, the top of the fourth page, I added some language there to make sure that it is clear that school staff should put in place, let's see, well, no, I was thinking about another change I made. The purpose of this is to make sure that parents and students recognize that there might be some situations in which school officials really have no power to do anything to a student or an employee who no longer works for them. We do get complaints sometimes about employees who no longer work for the system, or students who no longer in the system. Obviously, this policy is going to require reports to law enforcement if necessary for serious misconduct of a sexual nature. But I thought it would be a good idea just to make it clear that if a student has graduated, we can't obviously come back and suspend the student. And if the employee no longer works for us, we can't terminate the employee. The employee is already gone. So we do get complaints sometimes wanting to know what are we going to do about a situation. We report it to law enforcement, but beyond that, if the student's no longer here, the employee is no longer here, there's really nothing in the jurisdiction of the school system that can be done to take action against that person. Although, unless they have a teaching license, and then we can report their license to DPI. And in fact, are required to by statute, and regulation to report certain allegations of misconduct to DPI.
And are those certain allegations listed somewhere?
They're in a North Carolina Administrative Code regulation.
Is that something that we can at least reference in this policy?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea. Stephanie, thanks. I'll make a note of that.
Also too, when we're talking school official, does that mean, what does that mean? Like, at what level are you a school official? Is a counselor a school official? Is a principal?
I think in that context, my intent was to refer to people that have the authority to take the action, but it wasn't defined exactly. So it could be a principal. A principal has authority to initiate disciplinary action against students or recommend disciplinary action against staff. So it's probably principal and above.
So is that not worth noting a definition of that as well? Because I think some people maybe think they're reporting to the right place, and they're not. Or if they don't get not the answer they're looking for, but if they don't get
Sure.
the service that they think
Okay.
they need, then they need to go somewhere
All right.
higher.
Good idea. Thank you. Let's see, so the next page over, I did add a requirement, no, I think it was already in there, the requirement that the additional investigator explain the process to the complainant and respondent. I think we heard some comments about that, and I do think that's important because it is a legalistic sounding policy. I think by their nature, these kind of policies have to be like that because they track legal requirements, but the average person is not going to really follow some of the language and shouldn't be expected to. So it is important, I think, that the investigator sit down with and explain the terms and the process to the people involved and answer their questions.
And the only other thing, when I said this last time, and I will say it again, when you have the policy that says initiating the investigation, there is sometimes a misunderstanding that that means the criminal investigation. And so it may be that you need to say specifically the Title IX investigation, which indicates more internally with the school process than it does the external piece, because they can be and it can be going on simultaneously, but it really is important for people to understand that if they're reporting it to school officials, you have no power in the schools to do anything criminally or hold anybody liable criminally in any way, shape, or form. And I think that it's important for people to know that does need to be a distinction. And I see that you do have, and we have initiated a time frame when you want this reported, but I do think it's really important to, if people are in doubt, they should report it to law enforcement. And it should be very clear in your policy that when in doubt, you report it to law enforcement. Because if it's not going to fall under a criminal statute, you're going to be very quickly notified that it wouldn't fall under a criminal statute. And then it kicks into your Title IX investigation after that.
That's right. I would really be happy if everybody understood that the school system does not conduct criminal investigations. I think that would be beneficial for the entire community. So yeah, absolutely. There's a big difference.
Huge.
So would you put that under filing a complaint under C?
I would put it, so under the second page, you have reporting by employees or other third parties, where it says mandatory reporting by school employees. And in that section, I would even put just a note that says, when in doubt, report it to law enforcement, and that to be very specific, that criminal investigations are not conducted by school officials. So it would still need to be reported to law enforcement.
But you're talking about them reporting from employees to, for the school system to report to law enforcement. But I thought you were talking about specifically the complainant or complainant's guardian reporting it as well. So to me, those are two different things. So if the school system is doing the reporting, that's one thing, but if you're saying that, say that the parent is also, so that's two things. So it should be in two spots then.
And honestly, I don't know that you can put it enough, because what we're also looking at here is within 24 hours, as soon as possible, reasonably possible, but in no later than 24 hours. The other thing I think that hems us up a little bit is I do not, like our staff coming in and doing programming, if we're disclosed to by a student, of some incident of child abuse or neglect, we, the person disclosed to, have a mandated reporting requirement to disclose that and make that report to DSS right away, or law enforcement as the case may be.
Well, that's important, because to me, those are two different things, and that, we were talking about that today, about, who do you report to first? That's very, very important.
So as an outside person coming into the schools, I would say to you, I would not be interested in having Carousel Center team coming in and doing programming if we were not supported in doing the mandated reporting, even if part of the policy is I still have a chain of command within the schools that I'm going to be alerting, and I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to have those people there, but we are still gonna make that report within that 24-hour. My person is still gonna be empowered to make that report within that 24-hour period, or as soon as possible. If that's sooner than 24, great. If it's not, because honestly, DSS and law enforcement are gonna very quickly let you know if this is within their purview or not in their purview. And then I think it bounces back to you all to look at, do we need to do an internal Title IX investigation about how this all came about?
Do you think it would be beneficial then to, where it says, anytime it says in our policy investigation, to say Title IX investigation?
So that it's clear it's
Every
not the
single
civil
time,
piece,
it's the
not the
same
criminal
investigation.
piece, it's not the criminal piece.
And then in the definitions, when we put Title IX investigation, we can make sure that we have a Title IX investigation is not a criminal investigation. It is, an investigation initiated by the school system to maintain compliance with Title IX.
And I think that, again, it gets cumbersome with the words, and this is legal, more legalese and again, that will go to our education too, to be repeating that education to really help people understand. That our goal as a community is safety of children first, and ensuring that if there is a criminal process or a child protective issue, that we are getting those professionals that are mandated by our community to do those investigations, and you are staying in your lane to do the Title IX investigations as it applies to school processes.
So is that 24-hour reporting piece important? Like suppose if somebody is not ready to report it within 24 hours, like emotionally ready to report that.
The reporting is not about the person making the report, it's about who you make the report to and their response. So if you report to me, then I should be reporting, if I think there's a legal issue, immediately to law enforcement.
Okay.
Once that disclosure is made,
Okay, so it's not-
that's the question of.
Yeah, it's not about the victim making the report, it's about who they reported to and their reaction.
And that's what we were talking about, okay, once that disclosure is made, then then it's, okay, the question is, okay, even if other agencies are involved, that disclosure has to be made to law enforcement.
Gotcha.
And I guess that's the question, is knocking everybody else out of the way, you make it to law enforcement, and then you bring everybody else in, is my understanding, correct? So that's what we have to put in policy, is that piece. And then the piece with, I guess, the parent reporting, as well as under that division of, we're doing the Title IX, but you also have the piece of the possible criminal investigation, and that's very different. So teasing those two pieces out in policy is what we're talking about here. So, correct?
It is, yes.
And I want to just be clear, the way I read this is, if you witness or as an employee have someone report something to you, you have no more than 24 hours, not only to make that report to law enforcement, if that is appropriate, but you also have the same 24 hours to make the report within the Title IX system to the school system, in the school. Is that correct?
That was on the pink paper, and that was a question that was left, like, alternately, you can say 1 business day, but I think everyone had decided last time to leave it at 24 hours, because there's no point in waiting. I mean, it could be Friday afternoon, and someone has made that disclosure on Friday afternoon, you need to report within 24 hours. I mean, I wouldn't want to wait until Monday morning, a lot can happen over a weekend. So, I mean, I don't know how everyone else feels, but,
Yeah, we have folks who respond on the weekends.
right.
It's not an uncommon piece for us to have to respond on Saturday.
And for an example, it would be the opposite. student who has an issue that occurs on Friday, but it's never disclosed to the campus. They show up at a hospital on Saturday night. Then we're notified, but by that time, forensics and everyone else is involved. And then we begin our investigation as soon as we know on that need to administrate.
Okay, so going back to what we need to add. What do we need to add?
I think that we were talking about just making sure that where you have investigator or investigation within the school policy, that you're being very specific that it is the Title IX investigator or the Title IX investigation, so that it is not misunderstood that this is criminal in nature.
So probably we could just search every incident of investigated or invest and make sure that we're specifying what we're talking about.
I'm trying to think through that because even though this is the Title IX committee and this discussion is about Title IX, this policy actually is broader than Title IX. It covers bullying and discrimination. So I'm wondering, is it going to be confusing to separate out a Title IX investigation versus a bullying investigation or a discrimination investigation? Or should you just leave them all together?
Well, can we call it a school system?
School system investigation.
Differentiate that
Right,
from
okay.
criminal.
Yeah, because then that way
That's
you're,
right.
it's clear that you're really saying this is not gonna get you a criminal outcome. There's not gonna be jail time after this investigation.
Right.
And maybe also put that on the form, the reporting form as well, so, to spell that out, that this does not trigger a criminal investigation, or this form is not for reporting the criminal, but there's something to that effect, but this will trigger a school-based investigation. So,
So when you're looking for a short word, district investigation is probably the easiest way to do that. And I'd also on the form note that if there is evidence of potential criminal or suspected criminal wrongdoing, we will report to law enforcement.
And not to pile on with the definition for responsible employee, I think is really important. We'll just look
It
at
says
that.
any employee is there, so it's not.
And I like that you have other agencies too in there too, because that's important.
There is a typo in that paragraph about mandatory reporting too.
Okay.
Where you say, it says, you know, as soon as reasonable as possible, it sort of currently reads, but in no even later than 24 hours.
I think it's supposed to say not later than 24 hours.
Okay. So,
What's page?
again, I'm not trying to rush this, these steps, so if you want to go back to any of the other points, let me know. So I'm just trying to hit the major changes. So on the 5th page, where I'm numbered down at the bottom, it talks about the situation that we discussed previously about when the allegation is of a potential crime of a sexual nature. Law enforcement has asked us to let them investigate first, and we have said that we will. But the language, the policy as initially written said that the school system would immediately investigate and thoroughly and promptly and thoroughly investigate. So I added language for that law enforcement situation to make it clear that if we are asked not to, then we will let law enforcement investigate, but in the interim, we will consider interim measures to protect the parties pending the completion of our investigation. So there, for instance, and then I added a description of some of the more common interim measures which can be put in place. And this, again, interim measures are the measures you put in when the system is, law enforcement has not completed the investigation, school system hasn't completed its investigation, or maybe even hasn't started its investigation. So we don't know whether anyone is guilty or innocent at that point, but we need to put in measures to protect people. So you could put stay-away agreements, you could provide counseling, you could change work or class schedules, increased monitoring of areas on campus and other accommodations. So that is added in there to make sure our staff know that if law enforcement is investigating, that doesn't mean that they aren't to be proactive. They are to still go in and make sure that things are put in place for the protection of the student. And it could be both respondent and complainant at that point, because my reading has indicated that even for the respondents, it's very stressful and can cause anxiety for them as well, and sometimes they seek counseling during the process as well. So that's why that is in there.
But
So,
wait, can we go back?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I know that we have to be very cognizant of working with our law enforcement partners, but can we not put in there something about we may be limited in our investigation due to law enforcement, rather than saying that we cannot do an investigation? Because we can, I think, always do something.
Yeah, it's gonna be timely.
Yeah, I don't want to put in there that we cannot do anything, because I think that we have to have the ability to do something, and we've got to work with law enforcement on that.
I tried to hint to that, but maybe I didn't make it as clear when it says on the top of the page, the 6th page, carrying on, I guess from the 5th page, it says, if requested by an appropriate law enforcement officer not to investigate or not to do a full investigation. So my intent was to say we may be requested not to do a full investigation, but still be allowed to do a partial investigation, which might allow us to talk to our own staff members, but not allow us to talk to the complainant at that point.
I think it would be better to say we may be limited in the scope of
Okay.
our investigation.
All right, I can describe that in a little more detail.
And maybe even in the sentence, if the investigator's investigation is delayed, we'll say, or limited at the
Right.
request of law enforcement.
And I don't think it's gonna be that you're not gonna be able to do a comprehensive investigation. It's the timing of that that will not impede the
Right.
criminal investigation.
Right.
So it's just a matter of at what point are you?
Yeah, we will be allowed to, at some point, complete the investigation.
And one thing that I constantly bring up, and so I'll bring it up again, is that a criminal proceeding and a civil protective order are two very different things, but take two very different times. Whereas a criminal proceeding may take a long time, a civil protective order takes a week, and it is a finding of fact by a judge. So a lot of times someone can get a protective order in a week, and it is a finding of fact, and it is in court, and two people are in court. So sometimes the victim, and I love that because in that week that is found to be a fact by a judge, may have a protective order in place whereas the criminal court may take much longer. And so that is a different situation where you suddenly do have something that you can honor and legally are bound to by the court of law. So that can get tricky because whereas they may not have found criminally, but that's in place, and a no contact order, and the criminal side may not be something that is proven. It is that the civil protective order has gone through that court process very fast in North Carolina, where both people have been there, have gone through that piece, have had access to lawyers and have been proven. So that gets really tricky, and not a lot of people know that that's two separate processes that happen. So that's something that also comes into fact, and that you are kind of legally obligated to be aware of and know, and then you put both of them at risk because if that person breaks that protective order, they're criminally liable for that. So that is a tricky thing that happens. And you'd be amazed by how many, both our students have them, but so do our parents and our teachers. We work with quite a few of our educators and things like that. So that's something to keep in mind.
Something else here on this, I think we need something, and I don't know if it goes in the policy or the procedure, but about letting both sides know what is going on, that, if the investigation has been suspended because of what's going on with law enforcement, I think we need to make sure that everyone involved is aware that that's why things are not moving forward and what's going to happen next.
That's a good idea, yeah.
And to piggyback on that a little bit too, my question was,
Yeah.
if we are gonna put some things in place,
Yeah.
are you allowed to tell, like what you put in place? Because I think it would settle a lot of parents' minds if they knew exactly what you had planned to do. You know, versus like, are you gonna change my bus schedule? Are you gonna change the other person's bus schedule? You know, because we've had some issues with that. You know, I don't want to go into detail, only what I've read in the news. But, you know, is it fair that we tell, I know a lot of times you say we can't tell for the privacy of the person, but can the, will you tell that side what you're, either side what you're doing? Does that make sense, or is that?
For interim measures.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have to tell.
Okay, I just didn't know if you did that or not, because it appears sometimes that that is not happening, or that the.
Well, what we don't disclose is if a child receives so many days of suspension, we
Okay.
don't give them that specific information.
Okay.
However, when it comes to safety plans, when it comes to a stay-away agreement, a class change, a school change, because we've had situations where we did immediate campus changes, all of those things are disclosed. If that student is no longer on that campus, we can tell the parent, or that student is no longer on that bus, or we can provide that so that the child who is a complainant feels that a safety protocol is in place so that they don't have to feel that there is no option for them, or they have to remain in a level of anxiety or fear.
Okay. Well, I'm even thinking too from the respondent's point of view, because maybe they've been falsely accused.
Yes.
And that they need to know that their civil rights, or their, you know, they're being protected, you know, as well. You know, so from ostracization or whatever that is, you know, that kind of thing, so that both sides kind of know where we are along the way without giving too much detail.
And that's something that comes up in, say, an investigation about discrimination, racial discrimination, where there have been slurs or writings and things along that nature. We do let each student know exactly where we are in terms of what they can or cannot do. So we do provide enough information because, of course, those are things that we try to bring them through restorative practices.
So obviously, any of the teachers involved, or the
Yes.
school administrator, or anybody, coaches, or whatever,
Yes.
they all kind of know the basic, the minimum, the need to know.
Right.
Not like the all, you know,
Right.
all the information.
Exactly.
The last major change is on the 9th page, or the third to the last page, in which I suggested substantially changing the provision about the complainant appealing the superintendent's decision to the board. I mentioned this previously in the meetings, that I thought the language in the policy that was presented was somewhat problematic in that in order to discipline a student or discipline an employee under North Carolina law in the public school system, the action has to be initiated by the superintendent. So you would have a situation in which the superintendent may find the complainant's allegations not substantiated, and the complainant then appeals to the school board and asks that the school board find the respondent guilty, and then discipline the respondent, whether the respondent is a student or an employee. And I just didn't think that was a workable scenario where you have the board trying to decide whether to find a student or employee guilty when the superintendent is not even recommending it. When by state law, it is required that disciplinary action in the public K through 12 system, that disciplinary action against employees or students of a significant nature be initiated by the superintendent. So I looked at the policy that is recommended by the School Boards Association, their template policy, which has been adopted by a lot of school systems in the state, including Pender County, and just inserted their recommended language, which says the complainant can appeal the superintendent's decision to the board, but the board can't then totally reverse the superintendent and find the respondent guilty. It says that the board may hear the complainant's appeal, direct that further investigation be done if necessary, and take other steps that the board determines to be appropriate to respond to the complaint consistent with the law and the due process rights of the respondent. So the board could say, we think this should receive another look by the superintendent, we think there needs to be more investigation, but the board couldn't actually reverse and say, we are declaring this student guilty, or we are ordering this employee fired, because I think that would run afoul of the K through 12 laws, which talk about the superintendent being the one to initiate that disciplinary action.
Is that a lot of onus on the superintendent for making that call? I mean, is that something that our superintendent, wants to say, all right, I say no, and then I mean, even though I guess that the board has the sort of the check and the balance of going back and deciding, I'm just thinking that we don't want to get into a position where somebody's now going to sue our superintendent because he didn't do enough.
Well, I don't know if it's unfortunately or not, but the reality is the superintendent really is the one who makes the final decision for the administration. And then typically his decision can be appealed to the school board. So anytime he makes a decision, he's at risk of being challenged.
Okay.
But as a public official, he is protected by public official immunity from complaints challenging his judgment calls.
So he's a public official even though we don't elect him?
Yes, in that context, because there is some, yes.
Okay, I'm
yes.
just asking for
It's into
clarity. I know how
legalistic
the
terms,
system works,
but
but.
yes, the superintendent is considered a public official even though he's not elected.
Okay.
So other than that, those were the main changes I had recommended, and I know Robbie had a few comments, and I addressed some of them, but probably not all of them, so feel free to jump in, and others, if you see anything that you want to discuss.
One more question. So if we, I don't know if this is a fair analogy or not, but in the way that we work now, let's say like a student gets, is accused or caught, with drugs on campus. And so the school system has their own policies on how we deal with that. They're innocent until proven guilty. But it seems that sometimes that the school system doesn't always match what law enforcement says. So is this kind of analogous to that when we're talking about a criminal investigation side by side with a school system investigation? Everybody's innocent until proven guilty, and everything stays the same, or with modifications until we finish. Is it kind of the same?
Yeah, I mean, if it doesn't say it, maybe it should, but there should be a presumption of innocence for every allegation of misconduct against student, whether it be drugs, sexual misconduct, or any other kind of misconduct. There should be a presumption of innocence. In fact, in the statutes, it does require before a student or employee can be disciplined that there be sufficient proof of their guilt. So they start out being presumed innocent, and there has to be proof presented that they are. And I don't think it goes into that much detail in the policy, but what this board has always done, and I would recommend keep doing, is use a preponderance of the evidence standard for determining guilt or innocence at that stage. Preponderance of evidence just means it's more likely than not that the person is guilty. Whereas law enforcement is looking at a higher standard of proof, whether or not it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the person has committed a crime. So there could be situations in which the results of the investigation from law enforcement and the results of the investigation from school officials are different, because they're looking at different standards of proof, and law enforcement is looking at whether a crime has been committed, and school officials are looking at whether their harassment policy has been violated. So school officials are not bound by the determination of law enforcement. They would hope to receive information based on the investigation from law enforcement, but they're not bound by law. If law enforcement says we're not gonna charge a crime, that doesn't end the process for the school system.
Okay. And is that kind of stated in our policy somewhere? Or in an opening, just again, for the layperson reading
You know,
that?
I don't think it is explained, but I can definitely add something.
Like some sort of like paragraph that explains that, because I think people, like you guys have pointed out several different times, all the different layers
It's true,
of,
you could have a case that does not have enough evidence for a criminal prosecution, but that doesn't mean that the schools might not have a preponderance of
Their
information
own.
or evidence that would say that they would take an action. It just is, what it needs to be clear is, if the school's investigating it, the preponderance of evidence is not putting somebody behind bars as one of the remedies. And I think that that's what people are wanting,
Right.
and I get it, I totally understand that, especially where our babies are concerned, but the reality is that's just not the way it works. And so I think that it would be important to know that it's a preponderance, that the school is adhering to a preponderance of evidence, which is what a civil case would do as well. Which is sometimes why you might have somebody not convicted in a criminal case, but found guilty in the civil court and held liable. And so I think that that's an important distinction.
I think also we may want to address what happens if the criminal investigation does find enough evidence to convict, and whether or not at that point the school's investigation goes forward. And my suggestion would be that it should, and what happens at the school system level in those cases.
So you were talking about a situation in which law enforcement has determined there has been a crime committed and has charged the individual.
Yes.
But yet that individual has not gone to trial,
Right. Well, they've not gone to trial, or
not
they-
pled guilty. It's
or
still
not,
pending.
or if they have, or if they have been found guilty, and
I
but
think your arms are tied.
Yeah.
Two different levels are tied.
Right.
There's charges, but no adjudication,
Right.
you're in a little gray area.
Innocent until proven guilty, even in a
Exactly.
criminal case,
but
But it does up the responsibility.
it does.
yeah, I mean, at this point, we have a child that has been charged, and we have still an alleged victim, but we do have more
Yeah.
responsibility to protect that child, and if that child is convicted,
Yeah,
depending on what their punishment is, they may still be within the school system.
right.
And,
And this board has terminated employees and expelled students in that very scenario when they have been charged but not convicted, if the school board has sufficient evidence at that point to go forward.
okay,
And a lot of it depends on what the school board can get from law enforcement.
I think that we need to spell that out. As a parent, that's something I'm going to want to know if my child is involved on either side.
It's gonna be difficult to spell out because those disciplinary actions are gonna be coming from the superintendent. And they're subjective. He will make his decisions based on,
But what I'm
Well,
hearing
we don't
here,
have to say what the decisions are going to be, just that we're going to continue, that the consequences are separate from the legal system.
yeah, I think what she's saying is that closing of a actions by outside agencies does not preclude us from taking our own action.
Correct.
And we do that already. As Wayne said, we have suspended students who were still awaiting adjudication. I've gone to jail and handed people their termination papers. So,
Well, I think one of the things our resource committee has talked a lot about is just that kind of public awareness campaign that maybe would help solve a lot of this, is kind of that clearing a lot of these things up. And a lot of it's just information sharing, and how do we get this information out? A lot of it is just that people don't know this until you need to know it, and then you're in a lot of crisis, and so you're not hearing all the information that's coming in, or you don't have a clear understanding of what's gonna happen, or what should happen. So a lot of what we've met about, but also what we kind of all try to wrap our heads around, is how do you get so much information out there that can go, I mean, every time we try to address another page, there's 7 other directions to go in, and how do you concisely try to get that information out in a way that's meaningful before people know they have to hear it or need to hear it? And I think that's where we're gonna have that challenge in our committee, is then how do you disperse this information in a meaningful way that's easier to digest than these wonderful pages.
And I think the other
challenge.
in our community, the other thing we don't rely on is that you've got agencies that are already charged with doing the advocacy and the support for folks that are struggling to understand. If so one of the ways that I feel like we could do a better job is making sure that people are connected with those agencies like domestic violence, like rape crisis, like the Carousel Center, that have advocates on staff, that if somebody is struggling, that's not knowing who do I go to, or how can I talk to, or I can't get my detective to call me back, or, you know, those pieces are not necessarily within the purview, or should be something that we should bog down the school personnel with doing, but rather you do have agencies that would be willing to and can do that, and if we get them connected a little bit better and have them understand that that's free and confidential, and it's already in your community, in every community, you have access to that. I just think that people don't realize that, because again, if you're in a crisis state and you are just breezing through all this at the beginning of the school year, God, I hope nobody ever has to use any of what we're dealing with right now. I hope it never comes up ever. But if it comes up to your kid, then all of a sudden, now I'm a lawyer going through this, and I'm a lawyer, and I'm the best lawyer there ever was, and who wouldn't be that way? Every one of us probably would be if it's our kid that's impacted. So don't forget, there is a journey that doesn't have to go walked alone. We have a lot of resources in our community that does not put it on the backs of school system personnel.
Well, I will say too, the good part is with a lot of the people at the table, across the table, we know each other, so it's good because you'll be, oh, that person worked on shifting boundaries, or don't worry, I remember I was working on a protective order, and it was like, oh wait, I know that social worker, don't worry, let's go get that phone number, you're good, like this person, and so it is an easier connection when we're making those connections, so like you
And
said.
that's the beauty of just the beginning of what has come out of this committee
Yeah.
already. The progress that has been made, and the connections, and the communication, the collaboration, how you're leaps and bounds in such a short time for New Hampshire County Schools. I think y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for the progress that's been made for our students already, coming straight out of this committee, and the collaboration that's going on between the community. So kudos to all of us.
Yeah, and we'll continue to figure out how to push all this out, I think, and to push it out to other communities, to say, okay, here's the blueprint. You know, figure out how to make it work in your community, because it's working in ours. And I think there are probably other people that aren't at this table that should be, and hopefully, the Title IX coordinator that we can move on next to, determining that job description.
Can I add one little thing to this, is, you know, all of this information that just happened here, I think is fantastic, and I think we just need to put a pin in it to make sure a list of these resources go to every single Title IX coordinator in each school and the investigators, so that is in a consolidated spot.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and that will be something that will be on the Title IX, the district's Title IX coordinators to-do list, is to get this out there. I mean, that person will have a seat at the table, so if we can, and I don't want to end this policy discussion, but Wayne, if you could maybe come back and make the changes, the suggested changes, and then bring that back to the subcommittee. If y'all don't mind, given the time, we'll do without the breakout sessions this time, and just talk about the job description, if that's okay, because I really want to get to that so we can then get that job description out and start advertising, because I'd love to get that person around this table for next time. Absolutely. Is that okay?
Yeah, let me tell you process-wise how I'd like to proceed, not with the job description. You can be looking at that while. Typically, what I do is, for an important position like this, is I have a committee. We do it in 3 steps. One is the paper applications. We go through those to make sure they meet the qualifications. Then I have a committee that actually does the interviews. And I typically don't sit in on the first interview. And then we get 3 finalists. And then I would interview the 3 finalists and take one of those to the board. So if you would like to serve on that first interview panel, make sure Crystal knows so she can put that together. And that can be community non or school folks as well. That's not limited to school folks at that point. So if you would like to, once we get to the interview stage, usually a 7 to 8 member committee. So if you look at the job description, John, from the HR perspective, anything you should know about this? Some of it's instinct is HR formatting.
It's HR format. It's pretty, I mean, just cut and dry going across, I think. We're trying to get all the descriptors in of the type of individual we're looking for as best we can, and then the things they'll be doing, what skill sets we're looking at. But it's generic and it's pretty open, so.
And this will be their only responsibility.
Right.
I mean, we anticipate that they'll overlap some of the equity work that we're doing. I think those two go together.
They do. I'm just asking because
First
I've already
year,
had inquiries about people contacting me. I'm like, I have no control over this.
yeah, the first year there'll be, I anticipate a lot of them. That person's got a lot of training to do and a lot of processes to put in place. Because even with us doing the policies, the procedural aspect, they've got to come up with the forms and the record keeping part of that. So it's going to be a busy first year for this person.
Is supervisor the right title? Is that like strong enough for what we are asking them to do? And I don't know if you guys, like if you were to say law enforcement, you call them the wrong rank, then you're in trouble. So, is
Yeah,
this
it
the right
fits
rank?
on, I mean, looking at what we have budgeted and where it fits on the scales.
Okay.
I'd also just like to say too, I've had a lot of community members have like texted me or emailed me about, make sure that it's a woman, make sure it's a woman. And I just, as an advocate for victims, I will tell you that I don't think that the gender identity of the person who does investigating or working with victims matters as much as, are they skilled, are they do they have compassion, and are they sensitive to whatever the issue is? I have seen fantastic investigators that are working with male victims, working with female victims that are either gender. So I really want to just say that and go on record. I'm on Facebook Live. You guys can feel free to send me messages if you don't agree with me. But I just feel like that we get stuck in that realm, and I don't think that that's the issue. It's what is their skill level, what is their compassion level, and do they find this a passionate reason to be a part of our community to help make sure kids are safe and able to go to school, which we know benefits us all. That they stay in school and get a good education, free of being scared and terrified to move through the school system. So that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you. There's one right there. Yes.
All right, so looking at the actual job description, anybody have any issues with it? So we will, Ms. Bowie, can we get the HR to post it tomorrow? It'll be live for 10 days. So again, if you would like to serve on the interview panel, let Crystal know. 7 to 8 people would be great. Sort of leave that person.
And so they do the application online.
It'll be an online, yeah, our process is all online.
I'm not proud.
Typically, we also usually ask for a cover letter and resume.
Snail mail.
Is there anything else that we didn't cover from last time that anyone else feels that we need to cover this time? Yeah, next meeting date, that would be important. I think next time what we'll start with is are the breakout sessions. I think policy could probably handle the policy as written. Education will take up where we left off, and resources. Yes, and hopefully we'll have the new Title IX supervisor in place.
Let me see after the board meeting.
Okay, so.
The interview process will take, like what is your anticipated timeline on getting the person in place?
I mean, 10 days to do the interview. 10 days for the applications. Then we set up the interviews, and I like to do the second interview almost immediately after. So, once you get to the 10 days, it can move fairly quickly. Reference checks and those things. But I mean, my intent would be to have the person, bring that person to the August board meeting, which I think is August 6th. August 6th? Yeah, August 6th would be when I would like to officially name that person.
So before the school year starts,
Yes.
we'll go into the school year.
Well, then you put that person someplace else, then you gotta work around their,
Then the 12th would be 4 weeks, the 12th of August.
12th would be great.
That way-
So then 12, going once, going twice?
Once you have to agree,
All right, so we'll do 12 at 3:30.